Today, we're tackling something truly epic. The entire sweep of Mexican history, a story stretching back millennia.
It's quite the undertaking.
Definitely. It's a monumental task, really, drawing on everything from unearthed cities and cryptic codices to colonial accounts, which can be tricky, and modern scholarship.
Right, a real mix of sources, each with its own perspective, its own biases sometimes.
Exactly. So our mission, if you like, is to navigate this vast terrain. We want to bring you the crucial insights, maybe some unexpected connections, and just a real sense of the forces that have shaped this nation.
Indeed. Think of this as your pathway to understanding the essential currents of Mexican history. We'll be looking not just at what happened, but why.
And how things connect, right? Causes, effects.
Precisely, and how different eras and events link up. We'll also touch on how our understanding of this history has evolved over time, as new sources and perspectives come to light.
Yeah, we want to go beyond just like a list of dates and names and really get to the heart of it. So where does a story this grand even begin? Seems logical to start with the land itself.
Absolutely. The stage for it all. The geography of Mexico.
Our sources consistently highlight how Mexico's incredibly diverse and often, well, challenging geography has been just fundamental.
Foundational influence, definitely. Consider the dramatic spine of the Sierra Madre Mountains, Oriental and Occidental. They've shaped settlement, communication, everything for centuries.
And then you've got these stark contrasts, haven't you? The high central plateau, which became such a hub.
A hub of civilization, yeah.
Compared to the arid expanses of the Sonoran and Chihuahuan deserts up north, it's really a land of extremes.
It is. And those fertile central highlands, blessed with volcanic soils, a more temperate climate, they just became a magnet for early populations.
Makes sense.
Coastal regions, naturally, became points of contact, trade, but also
Invasion.
inevitably, invasion, yeah. Meanwhile, the North stayed pretty sparsely populated until, well, much more recently, with modern irrigation making large-scale agriculture possible.
It's not just about where people could live, though, is it? The land itself, the resources it offered, they became key drivers.
That's a crucial point. How the natural resources directly shaped the political economy. The legendary silver and gold, for instance.
Right, that fueled the whole colonial engine.
The engine, yeah, drew global attention. Later, oil played a similar kind of role in the 20th century, and underpinning everything always, the ability to grow those staple crops.
The Three Sisters.
Maize, beans, squash. A constant thread through diet, culture, even religious beliefs. It's fundamental.
And this relationship with the environment hasn't always been easy, has it? There's a long history of adaptation, sure, but also significant environmental challenges.
Exactly. Think about the sheer ingenuity of pre-Columbian civilizations, developing sophisticated agriculture like terracing or the chinampas.
Those floating gardens, amazing.
Incredible, yeah.
Yeah.
Sustaining huge populations around Tenochtitlan. But today, Mexico still grapples with big issues. Water scarcity, serious deforestation, something like 15% loss since 1950.
Wow.
Urban pollution, climate change impacts. Think stronger hurricanes hitting the Yucatan. It's an ongoing story.
It almost makes you wonder how different history might have been if the geography was more, I don't know, uniform.
Well, it raises that classic question, doesn't it? Environmental determinism versus human agency. Geography definitely set the stage, presented opportunities, constraints.
But it was the human response that mattered.
Ultimately, yes, the innovations, the social organization, that's what shaped the course of history. You see distinct civilizations like the Olmec and Maya emerging in the tropics, the Aztecs in the Valley of Mexico, each adapting uniquely.
Okay, so let's move from the land itself to the people who first called it home. We're talking about a human presence stretching back thousands and thousands of years.
That's right. Archaeology points to humans in Mexico at least 12,000 BCE. We have evidence from hunter-gatherer camps, like in the Teotihuacan Valley.
And then the big shift comes with agriculture.
A pivotal development. The domestication of those key crops, maize, beans, squash, probably around 5,000 BCE, maybe earlier in some areas. This agricultural revolution, the Three Sisters again, was fundamental.
It allowed people to settle down.
Exactly. The shift from nomadic life to settled communities during what we call the Archaic period, roughly 8,000 to 2,000 BCE.
And from those settled roots, you get these truly remarkable, complex societies blossoming over, 3,000 years?
An incredible span of pre-Columbian history, yeah, with a fascinating succession of major civilizations. It's a lot to unpack.
Where do we even start?
Well, a natural starting point is often the Olmec. They flourished in the Gulf lowlands, say, 1500 to 400 BCE.
Famous for the giant heads.
The colossal heads, intricate jade carvings, and what looks like a pretty early form of state organization. Sites like San Lorenzo show hierarchy emerging around 1200 BCE. Think of them as maybe a foundational culture.
Influencing what came later.
Rippling through later Mesoamerican societies, yeah. Then, up in the Oaxaca highlands, you get the Zapotec.
Monte Alban.
Monte Alban, their amazing urban center, thriving from around 700 BCE to 900 CE.
What's key about them?
What's really significant at Monte Alban is clear evidence of early city-states, writing systems, sophisticated astronomy, and established dynastic rule, a big jump in complexity.
And then, of course, the Maya, spreading across southeastern Mexico, Central America.
From about 300 BCE to 900 CE, roughly their classic period peak, the Maya are just remarkable. You see the emergence of the Ahau, the divine king.
A very hierarchical society.
Highly stratified, yeah.
Yeah.
Monumental ceremonial architecture, incredibly advanced maths and astronomy, that sophisticated hieroglyphic writing.
It wasn't one unified empire, was it?
No, that's key. Their history is marked by cooperation sometimes, but also intense competition between powerful city-states. Think Tikal versus Calakmul Palenque, a landscape of rival kingdoms.
Okay, moving towards central Mexico, we hit Teotihuacan. The scale there is just breathtaking.
It really is. Flourishing from around 100 BCE to 700 CE, Teotihuacan became one of the largest cities anywhere in the pre-Columbian Americas.
How big are we talking?
Peak estimates suggest maybe 200,000, perhaps even up to 400,000 people, comparable to many Old World cities at the time.
Wow.
The sheer size of the pyramids of the sun and moon tells you this was a highly organized society. Interestingly, probably governed not by a single king, but maybe a collective elite.
Different model. Later, central Mexico again, the Toltecs.
Toltecs, yeah.
Yeah.
Rose to prominence between about 900 and 1160 CE, capital at Tula.
Maybe not as long-lasting, but influential.
Very influential on subsequent cultures. Tula was an important center, and their art, their religious ideas, got picked up and adapted by later groups, definitely including the Aztecs.
Which brings us finally to the Aztecs, or the Mexica, as they call themselves.
Right, the Mexica. By the time the Spanish arrived, they'd built this vast, formidable empire.
They came from the north, right?
Migrated from the north, settled on an island in Lake Texcoco, founded Tenochtitlan around 1325 CE.
And built their empire through alliances and war.
Exactly. The Triple Alliance with Texcoco and Tlacopan in 1428 was crucial. Then sustained military expansion. It was hierarchical, militaristic.
And known for ritual sacrifice.
Yes. Ritual sacrifice was a central part of their state religion, believed necessary to maintain cosmic order. And they built this huge tribute empire, maybe 500 city-states, sending goods and labor back to Tenochtitlan.
It's just so important to remember, though, that these big names, Olmec, Maya, Aztec, they weren't the whole story.
Absolutely not. That's a critical point. One source mentions at least 64 distinct ethno-linguistic groups in what's now Mexico, each with its own history, language, culture. The big empires, powerful as they were, only covered part of that incredible diversity.
Yet despite all that diversity, you do see some common threads running through many of these societies.
You do. Recurring themes like a deep reverence for cyclical time, dualistic deities in their pantheons, economies heavily reliant on maize, the crucial role of oral traditions for history and knowledge.
And no large herd animals, unlike the old world.
Right. No cattle, horses, sheep before the Europeans. That had huge implications for transport, agriculture, warfare.
So how do we know all this? How do we piece together the story of these ancient civilizations? What are the sources?
It's a fascinating mix, really. Archaeology is fundamental digs, provide the material evidence. Then you have epigraphers deciphering the writing systems, especially Maya script.
And historical documents.
Ethnohistorians analyze indigenous manuscripts, the codices, from Aztec, Maya, Mixtec cultures. We also have accounts from the Spanish conquistadors, like Bernal Diaz.
Which you have to read carefully.
Very carefully, being aware of their perspective and biases. And importantly, there are narratives from indigenous writers after the conquest offering crucial alternative views. It's interdisciplinary work.
All this leads to the question of political organization.
Yeah.
How did they go from early settlements to these complex states and empires?
You see a clear evolution. The Olmec laid some early groundwork for hierarchy. The Maya developed that system of independent city-states, each with a divine king, the Ahu, supported by bureaucratic elites.
Competing city-states, like Tikal and Palenque.
Right, often competing, forming shifting alliances. A very dynamic political landscape.
And the Aztec structure was quite different, more centralized.
Much more centralized, yes. Under the Tlatoani, the paramount ruler, advised by a council of nobles. Their empire, held together by that sophisticated tribute system we mentioned, conquered states providing goods and labor. Sources suggest maybe 500 entities were part of it.
And it seems like political power was always deeply tied up with religion.
Absolutely fundamental. Across Mesoamerica, rulers usually derived legitimacy from a divine mandate. Religious rituals, including, yes, the large-scale human sacrifice practiced by the Aztecs, weren't just religious. They were seen as vital for maintaining cosmic order, ensuring the state's prosperity. Political acts, in a way.
Did they have formal legal systems administration?
They did. The Aztecs, for example, had a fairly well-defined legal code, with judges tecutli to enforce it. Maya law might have been more based on custom and precedent.
And managing tribute, labor.
Required administration, definitely. Systems for collecting taxes or tribute, organizing labor for big projects, and keeping detailed records often in those codices.
Can we put any names to these early political figures?
It's harder for the earliest periods. Olmec rulers are mostly anonymous, though their art suggests powerful individuals. Same for Teotihuacan's leaders.
But later on.
For the Aztecs, we know Acamapitli became the first Tlatoani in 1376, founding the dynasty. Among the Maya, figures like Kinich Nanab Pakal of Palenque, who ruled for over 60 years, his amazing tomb was found, left a tangible legacy through building projects and political clout.
So, for millennia, these societies developed largely on their own. Then, early 16th century, everything changes. External influences arrive.
A truly pivotal moment. Before 1519, sustained contact with the Old World was basically nil for Mesoamerica. Then Hernán Cortés lands, an irreversible turning point.
And Cortés's expedition, it wasn't just military might, was it? It was complex. Political maneuvering, exploiting rivalries.
Precisely. Cortés, with a pretty small Spanish force, was incredibly astute or maybe lucky at leveraging existing tensions. The alliance with the Tlaxcalans, longtime enemies of the Aztecs, was absolutely crucial.
Plus the technological advantages.
Firearms, cavalry, they had a big psychological impact, even if numbers were limited. But tragically, the biggest factor was disease. Smallpox, measles, Old World diseases the indigenous populations had no immunity to. They were devastated, which massively undermined their ability to resist.
The fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521, a world-changing event.
It really was. After a long, brutal siege, the Aztec capital fell. The Spanish immediately started building Mexico City right on the ruins. Symbolically powerful.
But the conquest wasn't over then, right? Not everywhere.
That's crucial. The Aztec Empire was dismantled relatively quickly, yes, but elsewhere. The Maya in the Yucatan, for example, resisted Spanish control for decades. The last independent Maya kingdom didn't fall until 1697. It was a long, drawn-out process in many regions.
So what allowed this relatively small group of Spaniards to ultimately defeat such a large, established empire like the Aztecs?
It was a convergence of factors. Capturing Montezuma II early on created a leadership crisis. The indigenous allies, like the Tlaxcalans, gave the Spanish huge numbers on the battlefield. Disease, as we said, was catastrophic.
Maybe internal issues, too.
Some indigenous accounts suggest internal divisions, maybe even perceived betrayals among Aztec allies played a part. It wasn't simple.
And key figures stand out in this clash.
Absolutely. Cortés, the driving force. Malintzin La Malinche, the indigenous woman who was his interpreter, advisor, intermediary. Incredibly important and controversial figure.
And Montezuma II himself.
The Aztec emperor facing this unprecedented challenge. A tragic figure in many ways.
So conquest transitions into this long period of political evolution under Spanish colonial rule, New Spain.
Right. After Tenochtitlan falls, Spain establishes its colonial administration. The Viceroyalty of New Spain is formally created in 1535, lasts nearly 300 years until 1821, profoundly shapes everything.
How did Spain actually govern this huge territory?
Through viceroys, direct representatives of the Spanish king holding significant power. But there was also a check, the royal audiencia courts, judges who administered justice but could also review the viceroy's actions. A hierarchical system, ultimately reporting back to Spain.
Over those centuries, what political developments eventually paved the way for independence?
Well, you see the rise of constitutional ideas. The 1824 Constitution, after independence, set up a federal republic. The 1857 Constitution brought in liberal reform secularization, limiting church power.
And much later, the 1917 Constitution.
Emerging from the Revolution, yeah. Groundbreaking for including social and labor rights. A major shift.
But before independence, there were the Bourbon Reforms in the 18th century. Ironically, seem to have fueled the fire they were meant to dampen.
That's a fascinating insight from the sources, yeah. These reforms, meant to centralize control, make the colonies more profitable for Spain. They actually backfired. By favoring Spanish-born officials, peninsulares over American-born Spaniards, criollos, and tightening economic controls, they really alienated that Creole elite. They felt marginalized, started thinking about a future without Spain.
Which brings us to the War of Independence itself. Long, brutal, 1810 to 1821.
A protracted, complex struggle, kicked off by Hidalgo's Grito de Dolores in 1810. That initial revolt, though Hidalgo was caught and executed, ignited a huge popular rebellion.
But the leadership changed hands.
After Hidalgo, José María Morelos stepped up. A mestizo priest, he gave the insurgency more organization, a clearer political vision republicanism, built a more disciplined army, gained ground in the south, before he too was captured and executed in 1815. His ideas laid groundwork, though.
But the fight didn't die with him.
No. From 1815 to 1820, it shifted more to decentralized guerrilla warfare. Figures like Vicente Guerrero kept the resistance alive, preventing the Spanish from regaining full control. A war of attrition.
And then the final push in 1821 came from an unexpected direction.
Kind of, yeah. Events in Spain, a liberal revolt forcing the king to accept a liberal constitution, ironically spooked conservatives in New Spain. They feared losing privileges under a liberal Spanish regime.
So they embraced independence to preserve their status.
Exactly. Agustín de Iturbide, a former royalist officer, makes an alliance with Guerrero, the Plan of Iguala. Independent Mexico, but maybe a constitutional monarchy. They form the Army of the Three Guarantees. Spanish authority collapses quickly. Treaty of Cordoba recognizes independence in August 1821.
But independence didn't mean stability, did it? The immediate aftermath was chaotic.
Extremely unstable. Those first few decades, 1821 to mid-century, just constant turmoil. One source mentioned something like 75 different presidential administrations in 50 years.
Incredible.
You had the short-lived First Mexican Empire under Iturbide, then the First Republic in 1824. Constant struggles. Federalists versus centralists, liberals versus conservatives, the military always involved, the church powerful.
And this era saw huge territorial losses.
A devastating period. The Texas Revolution, 1835-36, led to Texas seceding, later annexed by the U.S.
Which led directly to the war with the U.S.
The Mexican-American War, 1846-48, catastrophic for Mexico, lost vast amounts of northern territory, California, New Mexico, Arizona.
The mid-19th century then brings the Reform era, but also more conflict.
Right, the Reform era, driven by liberals like Benito Juárez, trying to implement secularization, land reform, establish a more democratic federalist system under the 1857 Constitution.
Fiercely opposed by conservatives.
Leading to the Reform War, and then almost immediately after, the French intervention, 1862-67. Napoleon III installs Maximilian as emperor. Juárez eventually leads the liberals back to victory, but it's another incredibly disruptive period.
Then comes the long rule of Porfirio Diaz, the Porfiriato, 1876 to 1911.
The Porfiriato. Relative political stability, yes. Order, progress, and dictatorship was the slogan. Diaz focused on modernization railroads, foreign investment, economic growth.
But there was a dark side.
A very dark side. Political repression, land concentrated in fewer hands, huge social inequality. It looked stable on the surface, but underneath, discontent was boiling.
And that discontent explodes in the Mexican Revolution, 1910, 1920. Transformative, violent.
Hugely transformative. Sparked by opposition to Diaz's long rule and his fraudulent re-election. Madero's plan to San Luis Potosi, effective voting, no re-election, ignites uprisings.
Led by figures like Zapata and Villa.
Iconic figures. Zapata in the south, demanding land reform, tierra y libertad. Villa in the north. Diaz is forced out in 1911. But Madero's presidency is short-lived, overthrown in a coup.
And the country descends into years of factional fighting.
Complex civil war. Different revolutionary groups battling for control. Eventually, the constitutionalists led by Carranza prevail, leading to the progressive 1917 Constitution land redistribution, workers' rights, limits on the church, addressing many key revolutionary demands.
The post-revolutionary period then sees this long process of consolidation and the rise of one dominant party.
Right. The 1920s, 30s, Power gradually consolidates, often under revolutionary generals from the North Obregon Cayas. The key move is forming the National Revolutionary Party, the PNR.
Which becomes the PRI.
Exactly, the PRI. It establishes this dominant force that will shape Mexican politics for most of the 20th century. You also have the Maximato, where Cayas pulls strings behind the scenes. Then Lázaro Cárdenas's presidency in the 30s, really significant.
Why Cardenas?
Radical land reform, the Ejido system, communal land holdings, and famously nationalizing the oil industry in 1938, creating Pemex. Huge moves.
The PRI then stays in power for decades.
Remarkable hold. From roughly 1940 to 2000, the era of PRI hegemony, Mexico saw significant economic growth, Mexican miracle years.
But it wasn't exactly democratic.
No. Highly centralized political system, authoritarian tendencies at times, electoral manipulation wasn't uncommon. But by the late 20th century, social movements, demands for democracy grow stronger, gradual reforms happen.
Culminating in the end of PRI rule in 2000.
With Vicente Fox of the Pan winning the presidency. A watershed moment.
And that brings us, more or less, up to contemporary politics.
The 21st century sees a more competitive multi-party system. Fox, then Calderón from the Pan. The PRI returns briefly with Peña Nieto. Then Andrés Manuel López Obrador AMLO from the Morena Party wins in a landslide.
His platform focused on anti-corruption, social inequality.
Yes, though his administration has also faced criticism over centralizing power. And most recently, in 2024, Claudia Sheinbaum, also from Morena, elected as Mexico's first female president, a significant milestone.
Let's pivot now to the economic side of the story, so closely tied to all these political shifts.
Absolutely intertwined. You go from those pre-Hispanic economies, sophisticated agriculture like chinampas, terracing, craft specialization, tribute-based trade networks,
to the colonial era, which completely reshaped things.
Colonial mercantilism, all about extracting resources for Spain. Silver from places like Zacatecas, Guanajuato became the absolute cornerstone, plus dyes like cochineal. Mining drove the economy.
And large estates, the haciendas.
Dominant feature, yeah, relying heavily on coerced indigenous and African labor. Everything geared towards enriching the Spanish crown, often via the Manila galleons connecting to Asia.
After independence, the 19th century saw attempts at liberal economic reforms.
Right, like the Ley Lerdo in 1856. Aimed to break up corporate land holdings, church lands, indigenous community lands, hoping to create small farmers.
It'll work.
Often had the opposite effect, unfortunately. Land ended up concentrated in the hands of wealthy individuals, didn't really benefit the rural poor much. Mid-century also saw a cotton export boom, mainly benefiting Gulf ports.
Then the Porfiriato, again, big push for export-led growth.
Diaz actively courted foreign investment. Railroads, oil, mining, huge expansion, infrastructure modernization.
But who benefited?
Disproportionately, the elites in foreign capital. The majority of the rural population faced more landlessness, more hardship. It fueled that revolutionary anger.
So the revolution aimed for fundamental economic change, too.
Definitely. The post-revolutionary state played a much bigger role. Cárdenas nationalizing oil in 1938, creating Pemex, was huge. Then from the 40s to 70s, Mexico pursued import substitution industrialization, ISI.
Trying to build up domestic industries.
Exactly. Reduce reliance on foreign imports. Lots of state investment in infrastructure, too. The Mexican miracle period saw real growth.
But then came the crises.
Late 20th century brought new challenges. The debt crises of 1982, then 1994 major shocks, led to a big shift towards neoliberal reforms.
Privatization, free trade.
Privatizing state companies, and crucially, signing NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, in 1994. Big increase in export manufacturing, especially the maquiladoras along the U.S. border.
What about the economic picture today? Key challenges, opportunities.
Well, inequality remains a huge issue. The Gini coefficient shows that. Heavy reliance on U.S. trade, something like 80% of exports go there.
So diversification is important.
Crucial. There's growth in electronics, automotive, aerospace, but more is needed. Remittances from Mexicans working abroad are also massive, a vital income source. And those past crises, 76, 82, 94, they cast a long shadow, reminding everyone of potential vulnerabilities.
These economic transformations obviously had massive impacts on social structures.
Profound and lasting impacts, yeah. Pre-Columbian societies were generally pretty hierarchical. You had nobles, priests, warriors, commoners, artisans, sometimes slaves.
What about gender roles?
Varied quite a bit, but women often had significant roles in ritual and the economy, especially in agriculture and craft production. We see evidence of that in places like Maya communities.
Then the Spanish arrive and impose a whole new social order, based on race.
Based heavily on race and birthplace, yeah. The Casta system, complex hierarchy based on limpieza de sangre, purity of blood. Peninsulares born in Spain at the very top.
Followed by criollos.
American-born Spaniards. Then mestizos, mixed indigenous and European, then indigenous peoples, then enslaved Africans. It dictated everything: status, jobs, legal rights. And labor systems like encomienda and repartimiento were incredibly exploitative, especially for indigenous people.
Post-revolution, there's this push for a unified identity, focusing on mestizaje.
Right. Post-revolutionary nationalism really promoted the idea of the mestizo as the quintessential Mexican, trying to forge unity, bridge racial divides from the colonial era.
But did that have downsides?
Sometimes it led to marginalizing distinct indigenous languages and cultures, pushing for assimilation into this dominant mestizo identity. It's complex.
And modern Mexico has seen huge demographic shifts, evolving social norms.
Absolutely. Rapid urbanization, Mexico City becoming this megacity, lots of internal migration, often north towards the border, and the U.S. remittances changing social mobility back home.
And gender norms.
Evolved considerably. Women got the vote in 1953, increasing participation in the workforce, in politics. Plus, powerful feminist movements tackling huge issues like gender violence, reproductive rights, representation.
Yet, despite all these changes, major social challenges clearly persist.
No question. High levels of inequality, social and economic. The terrible, persistent problem of gender-based violence, the shocking rates of femicide, ongoing marginalization of indigenous communities. There's still a significant part of the population speaking dozens of languages.
Urbanization brings its own problems, too.
Strains on infrastructure, housing, services, sure, though sources also point to a significant growth in the middle class in recent decades, which is another important part of the picture.
Culture, intellectual life, religion.
Yeah.
These have been powerful forces shaping identity throughout this whole story.
Immense forces. The religious landscape itself shows dramatic shifts, from the diverse polytheism of pre-Columbian times, think Quetzalcoatl, to Catholic dominance imposed during colonization.
But not just simple replacement, right? Syncretism.
Exactly. Syncretic practices emerged, blending indigenous and Catholic traditions. The Virgin of Guadalupe is the prime example, incredibly powerful symbol. Later, you see Protestantism growing and increasing secularism, too.
What about intellectual and artistic life in the colonial period?
Largely shaped by European trends, scholastic philosophy, Baroque art, but often with this fascinating fusion incorporating indigenous themes, materials, aesthetics, a unique blend.
Then the 19th century brings new ideas.
Liberal secularism becomes more influential, positivist philosophy too. Thinkers like Gabino Barreda shaping education reform towards science and reason.
And the 20th century. Just an explosion of cultural and intellectual energy.
A really vibrant period. The Mexican muralist movement, Rivera, Orozco, Siqueiros using public art to express revolutionary ideals, forge national identity, iconic.
Sure.
Literary nationalism booms. Writers like Rulfo, Revueltas, philosophers like Vasconcelos and Octavio Paz grappling with what does it mean to be Mexican, and indigenismo, valuing indigenous cultures, gains real traction.
Post-revolutionary Mexico really doubled down on cultural nationalism.
The state actively promoted it. Educational reforms, supporting artists, recognizing linguistic diversity in Nahuatl, Maya getting constitutional recognition alongside Spanish, though global culture has a huge impact too, of course.
And contemporary Mexico. Still a cultural powerhouse.
Definitely. Think of modern Mexican cinema directors like Cuarón winning Oscars. Music, literature, Paz won the Nobel Prize. And social activism, feminism, indigenous rights, environmentalism deeply shapes contemporary culture. It's worth remembering, too, Mexico had the first primary school, first printing press, first university in the Americas, way back in the early colonial period. A long history there.
Let's talk about the military. Played a big, sometimes controversial role.
Undeniably. From indigenous warfare practices through colonial militias, independence armies to the modern forces, Mexico has been through major conflicts.
U.S.-Mexican War, French intervention.
The revolution itself, the Cristero War in the 20s against religious militants, the Dirty War, state repression in the 60s and 70s.
How has the military's political role changed?
Huge political power in the 19th, early 20th centuries, especially during instability. But since the 1940s, it's largely been brought under civilian control. That's a significant shift.
But today, the military faces massive security challenges.
Huge challenges. Dealing with powerful drug cartels, organized crime. This has led to the military taking on more policing roles, which is controversial. And the human cost, staggering. Over 300,000 drug-related deaths estimated since 2006.
It's interesting to think back to the Aztec Eagle and Jaguar Knights.
Or the rurales under Diaz, that rural police force,
Yeah.
and how the old federal army was basically destroyed in the revolution, replaced by a revolutionary one. Mexico even sent the Escuadron 201, the Aztec Eagles, to fight in WWII.
Mexico's place in the world, its international relations, that's another crucial layer.
Especially the relationship with the United States. It looms large over everything, complex, constantly evolving, from Diaz's pro-U.S. policies through tensions to NAFTA-USMCA integration, migration issues, security cooperation like the Merida Initiative against drug trafficking.
In Mexico's role beyond the U.S.
Increasingly important, a founding UN member, part of the OECD, often takes a leadership role in Latin America through CELAC, for instance, active in the G20.
Migration creates strong transnational ties, too.
Definitely. Vibrant Mexican diasporas, especially in the U.S., but also Spain, Canada. Remittances they send back are a huge part of the economy, sometimes more than foreign investment. And Mexico has significant soft power. Its culture, food, telenovelas, art recognized globally.
Thinking back, early colonial trade was super restricted, wasn't it?
Only Veracruz and Acapulco officially open. Spain didn't even recognize Mexican independence until 1836, tried to reconquer it. Shows that early struggles for international legitimacy. U.S. recognition of Carranza during the Revolution, the Bucareli Treaty later. Key diplomatic moments. And declaring war on the Axis in WWII was a big step onto the global stage.
Okay, let's wrap up by looking at the major modern challenges Mexico is wrestling with today.
Well, that post-revolutionary nation building, trying to fuse revolutionary ideals with PRI rule, it brought growth, yes, but also repression sometimes, like the Tlatelolco massacre in '68.
Then came democratization.
Late 20th, early 21st century saw that big shift. Opposition parties rising, electoral reforms, making elections more credible.
But deep problems remain.
Corruption is still a massive issue. Drug-related violence, as we discussed, is pervasive and tragic. Environmental challenges are acute. Water scarcity, especially in Mexico City. Deforestation, particularly Yucatan. Coastal erosion. Climate change hitting agriculture hard.
Social issues, too.
The crisis of femicide. The ongoing struggle for indigenous rights. Think of the Zapatistas in Chiapas. Issues in Oaxaca. Press freedom is often under threat. On the other hand, there's been legal progress on LGBTQ+ rights, like same-sex marriage becoming legal nationwide.
And AMLO's administration.
Focused heavily on anti-corruption, social equity. But as mentioned, faced criticism regarding potentially authoritarian tendencies' impact on democratic institutions. It's a complex, ongoing picture.
Finally, just briefly, how has the story of Mexican history itself been told? The historiography.
It's evolved a lot. Early histories, 18th century, often by Creoles, show that emerging nationalist sentiment.
Yeah.
20th century brought Marxist views, class struggle, and indigenismo, focusing on indigenous perspectives, cultural fusion.
And more recently.
More transnational approaches, looking beyond national borders, gender history, environmental history, adding new layers, more diverse understanding.
Are there ongoing debates among historians?
Oh, absolutely. About the nature of Aztec imperialism,
Yeah.
the real causes and outcomes of the revolution, the legacy of the PRI, how to view Cortés hero or villain, still fiercely debated.
And perspectives shift.
Yeah, recognizing how traditional accounts were often shaped by colonial views, especially about indigenous peoples. Now there's much more emphasis on using indigenous sources, like Nahuatl texts, to get a more balanced picture.
Are there still gaps in our knowledge?
Definitely. Pre-Olmec societies are still pretty mysterious. The history of African Mexicans needs more attention. Long-term environmental impacts of colonialism. Lots still to explore. Research continues, digital archives, oral histories are opening new doors. We rely on everything from archaeology and codices, like the Codex Mendoza, to colonial accounts like Bernal Diaz and modern historians like Florescano, Altman, Restal. A huge range.
So as we wrap up this, well, incredibly ambitious deep dive, what are the big takeaways, the overarching themes?
I think it's that dynamic interplay. Geography, the deep indigenous heritage, the profound colonial legacy, and this constant striving, this modern aspiration. That's the core of it.
It really is a story of resilience, isn't it? Resilience against conquest, ingenuity against environmental odds, and this continuous renegotiation of what it means to be Mexican.
Absolutely. You see these cycles of political change, economic shifts, the incredible cultural fusion, indigenous, European, African elements blending over centuries, all forging the complex, vibrant nation we see today.
And that deep, often turbulent history undeniably continues to shape modern Mexico's challenges and opportunities.
It does. Understanding those historical forces gives crucial context for today's issues. Consolidating democracy, tackling inequality, achieving environmental sustainability. The past is always present.
So a final thought for you, the listener, as you reflect on this vast historical panorama.
Hmm.
How does understanding Mexico's rich, complex past illuminate not just Mexico's present, but maybe broader global patterns of cultural encounter, political change, and how societies interact with their environment?